Welcome to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I'm Dr. Shannon Marquez, Dean for Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so honored that you joined us today for the third Global Seminar in our Collaboratory series this fall, which invites experts to step into the Collaboratory to discuss critical issues related to decarbonization. Now, today's seminar will showcase countries around the world that are working on developing integrated long-term plans to help identify opportunities for decarbonization, as well as align objects across the Sustainable Development Goals. And now, before we begin this important discussion, and especially for those of you joining us for the first time today, I want to provide a bit of background about the Global Columbia Collaboratory. The Collaboratory brings students and thought leaders and educators together. It promotes cross-cultural communication and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Now, students participated from over 39 countries around the world, and they're drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, as well as visiting institutions. This fall, we have 30 students participating from 12 locations around the world, and they represent 16 universities and are tuning in today from across Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas, including Brazil, China, Dominican Republic, France, Ghana, Greece, Morocco, Pakistan, Russia, Singapore, Spain, the USA, and Zambia. Using smartphones and laptops to access the Collaboratory virtual exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers through participation in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. Now, as learnings and perspectives are shared across the Collaboratory, students form project teams and receive funding to collaborate to tackle specific global issues and topics of interest. And the Collaboratory serves as an incubator for bringing ideas into reality by promoting new projects and innovative solutions to global challenges. Now, we are thrilled that undergraduate students from all over the world have been actively engaged in the Collaboratory every semester since it launched in 2020. And I encourage the global audience today to submit questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen as they come to you, because we're going to have an exciting discussion. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory Seminar, and I want to thank all of our partners and esteemed panelists. This semester, we are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Center in Rio and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And at this time, I want to introduce Lauren Burido, Chief of Staff for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who will give some introductory remarks and introduce our panelists today. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's such a pleasure to be with everyone today. This is the third in our seminar series, and we're getting into some more detailed case studies looking at specific examples of decarbonization in specific countries and sectors. And to do that, we have a wonderful, illustrious panel of leaders and thinkers on this issue. And we're very excited to be having their presentations. We're going to start with Adrian Vogelschlib, who's a senior climate change economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. He's based out of their Chile office. His work focuses on the design of effective and politically acceptable climate strategies. After him, we'll go to Ben Haley of Evolved Energy Research. Ben develops energy system models to support energy transformation decision-making, and his work has been used by the governments of California, Washington, New York, and New Jersey. Kartik Chandran is a global leader in sustainable wastewater treatment and engineered resource recovery. He's joining us today to talk about decarbonization, specifically of the water sector, which I think at this point in this class, a lot of the students already know that that is a large user of energy, and perhaps in some cases a sector that might be a little bit harder to mitigate. So we're excited for that. And then our final speaker will be Thais Kaseker. She's a project director at GIZ, where she works on biodiversity conservation and the implementation of protected areas and priority areas for conservation, and what that also means for climate mitigation. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to our first speaker. Adrian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I hope you are seeing my presentation now.
Yes.
So today, thank you. I will be talking about how from the Inter-American Development Bank, we are helping countries plan and implement a transition to net zero emissions. right? So I really want to say three things today. The first one is that we know by now that getting to net zero emissions is not only necessary, it's also doable and beneficial for countries who do it. It's not a sacrifice that we are asking any country to take on. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. In fact, it's quite complex because the Ministry of Environment is in charge of driving systemic change that depends on families and business changing the way they do business in all sectors, in transport, in energy, in agriculture, in building, etc. But the good news, and that would be my last point, is that decarbonization strategies are an effective tool that can help governments map all the changes that are needed, explain why they are important, and implement them, and actually even leverage international finance to help them fund the transition to a net zero economy. Right, so my first point is really to reiterate that we know that getting to net zero emissions is technically doable. Right? We work in Latin America and the Caribbean. This chart here shows you where greenhouse gas emissions come from in Latin America and the Caribbean. And my point really is that we already know basically the techniques and technologies that allow us to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Right? We know that instead of using fossil fuels for electricity generation, for instance, we can use renewable energy. We know that instead of having economies that depend on car, we can have more public transit, more walking, more biking, and also using electric vehicles for the vehicles that we need to use. We know that instead of destroying ecosystems to make more room for cattle, and instead of using fertilizers excessively, we can have a more balanced diet that depends less on beef, which would free a lot of space to protect high carbon ecosystems and the reforestation that can also sustain biodiversity. And we can upgrade agriculture practices to reduce the footprint and the GHG emissions from agriculture. And we also know that instead of using fossil fuels for buildings and in industry, we can basically electrify, use electric cook stoves, electric air conditioning, things like that. And then that's maybe a little bit more difficult today, but it represents a very small share of emissions, things like green hydrogen for reducing emissions from industrial processes and better recycling instead of bad waste management. Right, so it's doable, it's also beneficial. I think everybody knows now that renewable electricity has become the cheapest source of energy that mankind has ever had in all of history. That's because in the last 15 years, the cost of solar has been divided by more than 10 globally. And the cost of wind power has also been reduced drastically. The same thing is happening to batteries, which are a key part of the cost of electric vehicles and also an important part of the costs of a energy system based on intermittent renewables. And the transition to net zero emissions comes with other benefits, like reducing air pollution. In many developing countries, air pollution can cost up to 3% of GDP in terms of the health impact. Another benefit is to reduce congestion. In this picture, you see how the same amount of people takes much less room if you put them in a bus or if they bike or walk, compared to if they are using cars. Time wasted in congestion can also cost up to 3% of GDP every year in developing countries. Another key benefit is preserving biodiversity and the tourism revenues that come with them, for instance. At the IDB, we have a study that puts number on these benefits. We think it's up to 1% of GDP and 15 million net new jobs that can be created by 2030 if the region transitions to a net zero economy by 2050. Right, so that's the business case. But again, it doesn't mean it's easy. In fact, it's very difficult because, as I said, it depends on very important systemic changes in all of the sectors. A few months ago, we published a study on how much would it cost to achieve the climate change goals in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the number we found is huge. It's up to 20% of GDP, about $800 billion every year that need to be spent on climate solutions in the region. Right? Just to put this number in perspective, the developed countries around the world have pledged to make $100 billion available to all of the global south every year during the COPs. Right? So maybe $15 billion would go to Latin America and the Caribbean in that deal, which is very small compared to the more than $800 billion that they need. All the NDBs, like the World Bank, the IDB, all of our lending together, it's less than $50 billion per year. right? So even if we gave all that money to climate solution, it wouldn't be enough. Actually, even if all the governments in the region removed the energy subsidies, put a carbon price, and put a tax on congestion and pollution, they would still make a very small amount of money compared to maybe about a third of what needs every year. So the message here is that this is not about finding money to spend more. It's about redirecting spending from the private sector in all the sectors. And the first step in doing that is to have clarity on what it means for families and businesses in all the sectors to spend on things that are consistent with a net zero economy. Right, so a lot of us have already seen charts like this. This is from a project we did in Costa Rica, where we trained a local university to put numbers on strategies to reduce emissions at the national level. It's important that we work with the local university because we think the locals are in the best position to discuss with the stakeholders, both the governments and the private sector in the country, right? So what I want to show you here is really what I copy-pasted in the left from the National Decarbonization Plan, so it's in Spanish. But really the message is, what we're doing is not talking about net zero emissions by 2050 only, but explaining what that means in each sector, right? Discussing targets instead of how much more public transport do you want by 2030? How many electric vehicles do you want by 2030? What do you want to do to building installations by 2030? How many hectares of reforestation do you want by 2020, 2030, 2050? The idea is to put numbers and to explain how specific changes in each sector can sum up to a transition to a net zero economy, which, by the way, means reducing emissions from all the sectors and then increasing the forest area in the country to capture carbon as the trees grow. Right, so that's explaining what each sector can do, but then the key question is why they should care. And the answer we have from the same study is because of the net economic benefits. What we've been doing here is putting economic numbers on those transformations, right? Showing the costs and the benefits. The costs are known. They are the negative numbers in this graph. For instance, in orange, you see that you need more investments to buy all these batteries, to buy all the electric charging stations for your electric cars, to insulate the building, etc. In green, you see a small opportunity cost of using land for forest covers instead of producing agriculture goods that you could sell internationally. But then you have the benefits. The main benefits, dark blue, it's just the financial savings. Electric vehicles are cheaper, renewable energy is cheaper over the lifetime. You have an investment, but over the lifetime it's cheaper. So it's just a net financial saving. That's dark blue. And then in light blue, it's the other kind of benefits, right? The time saved thanks to less congestion, the reduced accidents, which I hadn't mentioned before, the better health outcomes because you reduce pollution. We put dollar numbers on that. In gray, we also put dollar numbers on the ecosystem services like tourism revenues that protecting forest can provide. And again, the fact that it's a net benefit, here we sum up to a $41 billion net benefit for the country, doesn't mean that change is gonna happen by itself. Because despite the benefits, there are a lot of barriers to implementation of a net zero economy, in Costa Rica, but in all the countries. And that's, I think, that the third thing that's important to discuss. A key kind of barrier is regulations, right? Regulations are often designed and built around incumbent technologies. I like the example of electric buses. This one is from Santiago, Chile, where I live now, but in Costa Rica, something similar happened, right? So in Chile, as a bus driver, the regulations basically mandated you to own your bus. And an electric bus can save you money in the long term, but it's much more expensive to buy than a diesel bus when you just have to pay upfront for it. But if you are a lonely, a single bus driver, buying an electric vehicle can cost like 50% of all you save. So for a bank, it's a bit risky to lend you money to buy an electric bus. And so what was happening in Chile is that banks would not lend money to bus drivers to buy electric buses because they found it was too risky. And the solution was to change the way the Ministry of Transport regulates the market for buses in Chile. They separated the bus driving part of the job and the bus owning part of the job. So now in Chile, if you are a big company like Engie, which is a big multinational energy company, you can buy electric buses for you as a power producing company. An electric bus is not a big investment, so you don't have the problem with the financing, and lease it to the bus drivers. So now for the bus drivers, instead of a risky investment, you have a super safe, constant lease every month that doesn't depend on a war in Ukraine changing the price of gasoline and doesn't require a lot of maintenance. And this is an example of how changing a sectoral regulation, in this case by the Ministry of Transport, allows you to mobilize private finance, in this case from NG, for instance, to provide a climate solution to the private sector, in this case, the bus drivers. And so regulations are one barrier to the transition, but they're not the only one, right? Another kind of barrier, for instance, is inadequate public infrastructure. In these pictures, you see that if you don't have sidewalks, or if you have very badly designed bike lanes, then don't expect people to don't buy a car and to don't commute by car, right? Another infrastructure problem is that you may need to connect the windy and sunny places in your economy to the consumption centers. Actually, about a month ago, we published this book on achieving net zero prosperity that tried to systematically list the kind of barriers that can prevent public and private spending in climate solutions, even if they are beneficial. Things like, again, regulations, infrastructure, but also price signals, political economy issues, lack of information. It's a lot of small problems that you have to fix in each sector. And maybe one very good example of how to fix these issues is what the government of Costa Rica, again, did with the National Decarbonization Plan, right? So again, the National Decarbonization Plan has the objective of getting to net zero emissions by 2050. And the first thing they do is to transform this goal, net zero emissions by 2050, into specific actionable sectoral transformation in the short, middle, and long term, like targets on electric vehicles, on buses, on buildings, etc. But they don't stop there. The most important part is that they define 70 immediate public investments and policy reforms that the government has to do in the next days and years to enable that transition, right? So the plan was issued 3 years ago. So for them, the next years and days was by 2022. So the 70 of them, but I'm just going to give you 3 examples and then tell you how we use that to leverage international finance. So for instance, public transport. The plan says by 2050, if you want to go to net zero emissions, you need public transport to be the #1 option for everybody. Like it is in New York. If you want to go from point A to point B, you think metro. You don't think I'm going to take the car. And you need 85% of buses to be electric according to the numbers. So that's the long term. It's not achievable tomorrow. Maybe in the middle term, you need 30% of buses to be electric by 2035. And then this government, what can this government do? It can do pilot projects to test electric buses, and it can update the regulations on bus concessions a little bit in the fashion of what I've showed you about allowing other companies to finance the buses. Another example is deforestation. I told you to absorb the emission, they want to move from 52 to 60% of area covered by trees. And the one thing that the government has to do immediately is to investigate how they can fund payments to farmers to basically grow trees on the land. And what we've done from the IDB, is to make a list of 20 reforms like this. I'm showing you 2 of them, but we really had 20 that were covering issues like governance and monitoring of the decarbonization plan, climate smart agriculture solutions, electrification of energy uses in all sectors. And we told the government, look, if you implement those changes in time, we will lend you almost $800 million. With that between the ADB, the French Development Agency, and other development banks. So it's just an example of how governments can use these kinds of plans as a reason, let's say, or as leverage to get international financing to help them implement them. The IMF also joined us in a way, right? And a bit of a stretch to say that, but the IMF diagnostic of the macroeconomic situation in Costa Rica recognizes that they have this decarbonization plan and it makes economic sense to implement it. And they use that as part of the justification to provide budgetary support to the country. Right, so that's really what I wanted to tell you today. If I summarize again, we know net zero emissions is necessary. It's also doable, and it can be beneficial for countries. Doesn't mean that it's easy, that it's very difficult, because you have to coordinate changes in all of the sectors. And even if the changes are beneficial, there are barriers to implementation. So you really need to map all of these barriers and then get the line ministries in every sector to intervene in the economy to remove those barriers and enable private and public spending in a net zero economy. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Lauren, and everybody.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Our next speaker, Ben Haley, the floor is yours. I don't know, actually, Adrian, you might have to stop sharing so that he can start. Oh, or maybe he's allowed to just take it. Great. Slides look great.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I actually think this is a really good order to be going in, because I actually think there's a pretty stark contrast in the role of planning in the United States, who's doing the planning, and how that's ultimately used potentially in policymaking. So I think we'll provide a nice contrast. I'm envious of the Costa Rican government's role in decarbonization planning. It doesn't work that way. In the United States, you're going to notice throughout this presentation that, we're playing, as Evolved Energy Research, a strangely central analytical role to some of these government processes, and I'll get into why that is structurally. But kind of the title of my talk is Deep Decarbonization in the United States. I'm going to focus initially on some of the analytical results that we're seeing in these decarbonization planning processes, and ultimately what we're trying to do with them in terms of ultimately transferring some of this over to the government, who, in a perfect world of policy and ambition would be doing a lot of these tasks themselves. So let's see. Slide here. Just a little bit of background on who we are. We're a consulting company that's focused on energy system transformation. We operate sort of at a variety of different levels. We've engaged in a lot of state level planning exercises where a lot of the climate ambition has been found in the United States. A lot of net zero planning exercises at state and regional levels we've participated in. We also have done quite a few of the recent national studies for the US. Those were really developed as a lead up to a potential Biden administration to sort of put some stakes in the ground in terms of what we needed. We also work with a lot of other actors within the energy system who are interested in some of the implications and some of the opportunities that can be found in a net zero system. The next kind of report that I want to talk about is our annual decarbonization perspective. This is our attempt to systematize some of this analysis, make it consistent year over year, illustrate changes, illustrate our sort of improved understanding, and turn what has, heretofore been something of a disjointed kind of academic exercise into something that's much more of a process and an ongoing update. We call it our annual decarbonization perspective. We've just started. We're planning on basically putting out this as an annual update. It's a follow up to our 2021 article that I know you read as a lead up to this. It's funded by Breakthrough Energy, and the idea is basically, on an annual basis, we'll update all of our data, some of our modeling capabilities, some of our scenarios to answer sort of questions people are asking, and the first goal, basically provide this modeling on a very granular basis that can be used to basically inform the understanding of the United States as to what it needs to do to decarbonize and approach net zero. What does a real emissions plan look like? The second goal, develop these public data sets for other researchers exploring energy system questions. So one of the issues in all of this decarbonization planning is basically the availability of information. So there are a lot of silos. People aren't sort of sharing best practices, things like that. So we want to make that a public resource. The third is that reinforcement of modeling best practices. There are a lot of ways to sort of go wrong in this space, and I think you can end up with kind of insufficient answers. And so we want to reinforce some of those modeling best practices and kind of put a stake in the ground in terms of what needs to be in these types of plans to make them kind of used and useful. And then finally, the thing I've been harping on is basically encourage institutionalization. We are a very small consulting company. This is a task that should ultimately be, being performed by a government entity with decision-making power and funding power and things like that. I say a la the annual energy outlook, that's a energy system planning or forecasting process that the US government undertakes, but it is not at all focused on net zero, which we'll get to. And there's the report link there. So our annual decarbonization perspective, going to net zero with a variety of scenarios, a variety of sensitivities. I'm going to focus on the scenario piece of this. And the idea here is that, ultimately there are a lot of consistencies across scenarios in terms of what we need to do, but basically we still have choices from here to 2050 in terms of how, we will ultimately achieve that net zero target. So I'm going to quickly run through these scenarios. The baseline is not a net zero target. The central scenario is sort of our all options case. If everything goes right, what does it look like? Our drop-in case is trying to basically do its best to leverage existing infrastructure. Existing players in the energy system, for example, have a lot of power. And so basically this ends up being a case with less political friction. You do some more carbon capture on existing assets, things like that. High hydrogen. So basically, people have imagined roles for hydrogen from a very small amount to a very large amount. We wanted to understand the implications at some of those higher ambitions. Low demand. So usually we model sort of consistent energy services. So basically, consistent vehicle miles traveled, consistent amounts of heat, things like that. But there is also a world in which we sort of moderate our consumption of energy system services, and we want to understand the implications of that. Low land, one of the real touch points right now in the debate about net zero and decarbonization is basically land use, specifically for the deployment of renewables. How do we do that so that we can achieve conservation goals while also achieving our emissions goals? So we wanted to understand sort of the response of the system if we're constrained in terms of available land for renewable deployment. Slow consumer uptake. One of the real challenges that we may face is basically people don't want to buy the things that they should from an emissions perspective. Basically, all of that goes slower. We may see supply chain constraints in terms of electric vehicles, things like that. So what happens in that world where basically consumers don't play ball the way we would like them to? And then finally, 100% renewables. This is an ambition that certain players in the energy system have. What does it look like if basically we don't take any fossil energy out of the ground, we don't allow nuclear, things like that? What are the implications there? So, all scenarios basically rest on these four pillars. We have electricity, decarbonization, we have efficiency and end-use electrification, and we have captured carbon. So decarbonization, we can't burn coal and natural gas. We have to do renewables. We may do some nuclear. We may do some gas with carbon capture. But whatever we do, we have to basically reduce the emissions rate of electricity, something like 99%. And that's why, a lot of policy goals end up being sort of 100% clean. Energy efficiency, we have to be about twice as efficient, almost twice as efficient in terms of our energy use per capita. A lot of that comes through electrification, but there are also additional sort of efficiency measures like building shell and things like that. And finally, captured carbon. This is sort of our carbon management. So in a net zero system, there are certain amounts of carbon that are captured and then sequestered. There are certain amounts of carbon that are captured and then utilized to make things like electric fuels. That's a principle of basically all of our systems, that some amount of carbon capture is necessary. But it's usually not in the sectors people have been thinking about, and it's a lot less than I think the ambitions of some players in the energy system. So if we look at two of the pillars here, efficiency and electrification, you can see that these are all final energy demands. So basically, energy demands used to perform a service. So something like driving a mile is an energy service. Something like heating your home is an energy service. So basically, if you look at the terms of the total, efficiency goes up. So we use less final energy in 2050 than we do today. The other characteristic here is that the share of energy that is electricity in that light blue goes way up. So we use less energy, but all of the energy that we use, a lot more is electric. And the reason for that is, the efficiency of that use. An electric vehicle is far more efficient than internal combustion engine, for example. And it also moves us closer to our primary zero carbon sources, which in the future are basically wind and solar. So the closer you can get to that, the more economic that is. This is illustrated here in the electricity decarbonization slide. If you look today, it's, principally coal and gas with a smattering of wind, solar, and nuclear. In the future, nuclear is basically maintained somewhere close to its current level. Coal and gas drop off. Coal drops off really quickly. Gas drops off a little more slowly, but relatively rapidly. And it's all replaced by wind and solar. That wind can be onshore or offshore. And the scale of that build out is really dependent on things like, do we have a 100% renewable target or things like that. This is our fourth pillar here, which is carbon capture. So on the top, what you have is basically where that carbon is captured from, what is the process of that capture, and then on the bottom, how is that used? So if we look at our central case, for example, we have a lot of carbon capture on things like biofuels. That turns into a negative emissions technology. We have a lot of carbon capture on things like cement. We have some carbon capture on blue hydrogen. And then that is used on the bottom there, either to basically sequester, so geologically sequester that to take that emissions benefit, or to produce electric fuels in the form of a gas or a liquid. And you can see, there are pretty large ranges of carbon capture in these cases, but all of them have a sizable amount, certainly compared to today, and certainly compared to a baseline scenario. How does that stack up in terms of energy system costs? Well, we model sort of vastly different energy systems, but the overall costs are relatively tightly clustered. Some of them are maybe a % GDP higher than our expectations of the central case, but all of them are lower than what we've historically spent on energy, and are not going to be anywhere near as volatile as basically energy has been in the past. The reason being that fossil fuel prices have extremely high volatility. And if that is the principal thing that you're paying for in an energy system, then what you pay has really high volatility. We've certainly seen that over the last couple of years. But in the future, basically with the efficiency, the decline in technology costs, we could really expect in terms of GDP terms to be paying less for the energy system of the future than we do for the energy system today. This is the kind of final takeaway, is that all of these things add up to emissions trajectories that go to net zero. So they had a 50% target in 2030 and they go to net zero in 2050. You can see precipitous declines in the use of coal, rapid declines in the use of oil, really as a function of electrification of transportation, and then slower declines in natural gas as we basically move that out of electricity, and also decarbonize buildings through electrification processes. There is still a residual amount of natural gas in these systems unless you basically disallow it in 100% renewables. That can be used even in the future under those emissions caps for some amount of industrial demand. So basically, there are a variety of ways to get to net zero. They can all take place at relatively modest costs, and actually, some of the interesting things in these scenarios are sort of the challenges that each potentially present in terms of siting or deployment pace or things like that. So going to the goals of the annual refresh, sort of why are we doing this? One, in terms of what is the use of modeling in this context? First, guiding implementation and target setting. We've basically, these models end up establishing sort of the waypoints for policy to try to aim at. What is possible, establishes sort of the realm of the possible. Better understanding challenges and forks in the road. The more detailed you get, the more you can represent sort of individual technologies, the more you can really illustrate some of the potential challenges. One of the things that we're focused on right now is supply chain challenges in terms of renewable deployment. We only know that because we know the ambition of that renewable deployment over the next 10 years or the next 15 years. So all of these things can basically be used to illustrate, some of the pace and scale challenges. We also use scenarios to illustrate what choices we still have in the energy system and what the implications of those choices are. So at the right, you can actually see those icons represent sort of higher or lower values given the scale of them. And so they're vastly different along some of these dimensions that kind of don't jump out at you unless you've kind of studied these on a scenario basis. And finally, these are useful for comparing to current policy ambition, engaging progress. So, we now have some measure of climate policy at the federal level in the United States, and we can use this type of process to compare to what we would say, an optimal pathway might look like. The second thing is reinforcing modeling best practices. Sorry?
Sorry, I was going to ask you to wrap up in the next minute or so. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. Reinforcing modeling best practices. So, the answer changes depending on how you model some of these questions. So it's really important to basically put a stake in the ground in terms of what we need to include to basically be able to represent some of these systems. The third goal, as I said, was basically public data. So we've produced a variety of public data sets that are available on GitHub and on Climate Deck to basically allow other researchers to engage with this question and engage with some of this research and develop sort of sub-analyses as a function of these scenarios. And finally, the institutionalization. So, we have been working to model a lot of the policy that has been working its way through Washington slowly. So we were modeling Build Back Better. We've modeled the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've compared that to our net zero pathways. Ultimately, these are the types of things that you would anticipate and hope that a government would be doing so they can make some of those informed choices. And so we've, worked on the side with government entities to sort of do that. But ultimately, we'd like to basically pass this over to, government institutions so they can codify sort of the expectation of net zero in our energy systems. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm loving the sort of synergies we're getting between you and Adrian's presentations. I'm loving the optimism of it being technologically feasible. This point that Adrian made and that you reinforced that it's spending differently, not necessarily spending a lot more money to try to bring about this transition. We are going to turn to our next speaker, Kartik Chandran, and we're going to hear about more of a sector-specific experience, the water sector. Professor Chandran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks for allowing us to share some of our work here. And so the focus of what I'm going to present is on decarbonization specific to the water sector. And so I always like to start with something very, very general and perhaps non-quantitative and non-engineering focused. So if you take a look at the water sector today, if we look at the model for the water sector today, it's really a linear model. It's not even a cycle. So we start on the left with clean water, and then we use the water for different objectives. And in these different objectives are embedded, of course, water that we drink, which is really a very, very tiny fraction of our overall water footprint. And then what comes out on the back end is, yes, we can call it wastewater, we can call it waste, fecal sludge, sewage, and so on and so forth. But really, if we want to really close the cycle, we should perhaps stop using the word wastewater and waste and really start to perhaps even use different terminology. The terminology I like includes, let's say, used water or even enriched water, because truly the wastewater that we have to deal with is really enriched. It's not just water, but it's got carbon, it's got nitrogen, phosphorus, and actually embedded energy as well. And so for a moment, let's go back to wastewater. And the lack of wastewater is really one of the global grand challenges that we face as a society today, as a society worldwide, not just in, and really it's a global grand challenge. And there is not a single region in the world that is immune to this challenge. And because of this, access to wastewater is really limited. It's variable for sure, but it's also many populations just don't have access to adequate wastewater treatment, sewage treatment, and so on and so forth. And so what is wastewater treatment? What is the current, generally speaking, what does the current practice of wastewater treatment, sewage treatment entail? Essentially, we are talking about, again, in a general sense, we are talking about centralized treatment systems, which basically look something like this, at least the blueprint of which looks like this. So essentially, the waste comes in, sewage, fecal sludge, wastewater comes in. Solids, inerts, particulates are separated. And then essentially what gets fed into these massive treatment tanks, biological wastewater treatment tanks, is a mixture of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in a matrix of water. And so that is what we're trying to remove then. And removal is by virtue of converting, let's say, the organic carbon into CO2, nitrogen into nitrogen gas, and then phosphorus sequestered into sludge. And then in the biological processes, we also foster the growth of organisms, microorganisms, bacteria, primarily bacteria. The bacteria, we should not lose them, dump them into the receiving body. So we recycle the bacteria. And then depending where in the world we are, the treated water can be disinfected or not, depending on the regulations, and then the water is discharged. This is not free, by the way. So during the process of wastewater treatment, sewage treatment, a high fraction of the energy goes into aerating, providing air for this into this biological reactor. In fact, 60 to 80% of a wastewater treatment plant's energy budget goes into aeration for cleaning the water. We also require copious amounts of chemicals for treating the wastewater. All of this has a footprint as well. And then on to another topic that is not very widely discussed, but is extremely important. The organisms that are engaged in treating the wastewater, particularly nitrogen, they produce a gas, nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide, as many of you might recognize, is a greenhouse gas, which is 300 times as bad as CO2. And it is also the most potent ozone depleting substance that we have been discharging into the atmosphere in recent times. So nitrous oxide is something that we really have to pay attention to. Okay, so this is what is commonly done, and as it is, I think I'm pointing out some of the inadequacies and some of the pitfalls of going towards conventional ways to treat sewage and wastewater. Okay, let's focus for a bit on nitrous oxide, and I'll show you in the next slide or so the two principal gases that really need to be looked at in the context of a water sector are really nitrous oxide and methane. Not as much CO2, it's mainly nitrous oxide and methane. So when we talk about decarbonization in the water sector, these are the two gases that we need to be focusing on. Again, nitrous oxide 300 times as bad as CO2, methane about 25 times as bad as CO2. Now, where does nitrous oxide come from? Nitrous oxide is a direct consequence of technologies that are required for the removal of nitrogen from wastewater. In what form does nitrogen exist in wastewater? It is essentially the form in which we produce nitrogen in our human waste, primarily in the urine stream, and that is in the form of ammonia and urea, which basically breaks down into ammonia. So for the wastewater sector, this is where our journey starts. It starts at ammonia, and ultimately we want to convert this ammonia into nitrogen gas. Nitrogen gas makes up about 79% of the atmosphere. It's inert, nearly inert, very non-reactive. This is so you could ask me, why don't we just go from ammonia to nitrogen gas? Just reverse the arrow. Sadly, it doesn't work this way because nature doesn't work this way. And so we have to go through the cycle. And along this cycle, this is where the damage is done. This is where gases like nitrous oxide and even nitric oxide, which is a constituent of photochemical smog, that's where it is produced. Anyway, and that's where a lot of my research in my group at Columbia, that's where we focus. And so we look at the nitrogen cycle as a whole. We look at the link between the nitrogen cycle and the biological carbon cycle. We aim to engineer technologies that clean the wastewater, but by minimizing the nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions, CO2 emissions, and so on, while producing clean water. Our work ranges from looking at microorganisms at the molecular scale all the way to global inventories for which we work with other partners. And that's what I'm going to show you initially. And so let's take a look at where we stand. And so this I'm taking from this table, I'm taking from the US EPA Greenhouse Gases Sources and Sinks inventory. This inventory is updated every couple of years or so. There's a more recent one that came out just last year or this year. And so again, look at what we're talking about here. From the wastewater sector, the gases of note are methane and nitrous oxide. And I don't want you to focus on the numbers right now. The bottom line is, till very recently, nitrous oxide emissions from wastewater treatment plants were actually directly ascribed to to those technologies that remove nitrogen from the liquid phase. So essentially what the inherent messages are activities that are geared towards cleaning up the water by removing nitrogen, converting ammonia to nitrogen gas. That action will have direct negative consequences in terms of nitrous oxide production. So the moment we say something like this, we are instantly defending whether we should clean up the water or whether we should stop polluting the air. And this is a very dangerous place to be in. Now, again, don't look at the numbers. Let's just take a look at the take-home messages here. The numbers notwithstanding, the true value of nitrous oxide emissions used to be grossly underestimated, because these are, after all, estimates. These are estimates, not measurements. And the true value in the US could be as high as the equivalent of 100 million passenger cars in the US added each year, coming from the wastewater sector. The population of the US is about 330 million people. So if you're talking about 100 million passenger cars, that's not trivial. So we're talking about something where we are truly stuck. First of all, the water sector has to take the entire blame if they want to achieve better water quality. That they're essentially going to take the blame for polluting the air. And basically, the magnitude of the emissions is actually quite substantial. And this is where we came in around 2006, 2007. We started to question this based on some of the results that we already had. And so let's come. This is really the slide that come. It's a summary of a lot of results, a lot of work, a lot of results. Essentially, what we found, and which is now the accepted viewpoint, is that clean water and clean air they are not in conflict, rather they are in concert. So this message that I showed you, ascribing higher gaseous N2O emissions to technologies that remove nitrogen from the aqueous phase. So water quality and air quality are actually not in concert. The same technologies that produce cleaner water are the same technologies that will result in, let me go back again one slide. They will result in lower emissions, jumping back. If this technology is engineered and operated and optimized to produce better quality water, it's that same technology that will also minimize emissions of nitrous oxide. So that's a very, very good positive message, because it basically says if we know what we are doing in terms of wastewater treatment, there's going to be an added benefit in terms of minimizing nitrous oxide emissions from these biological reactors. So let me jump forward. So let me take that statement and flip it around. Imagine all the parts of the world that do not have access to adequate sanitation, or adequate access to sanitation, wastewater treatment, and so on, nitrogen removal specifically. It is those very regions from which emissions of nitrous oxide are going to be far, far higher than the regions of the world which actually do have access to better nitrogen removal technologies. So now if you flip this one more time, an incentive to putting in better sanitation technologies, treatment technologies, can also be in terms of reducing gaseous nitrous oxide emissions. So as part of our work, we also worked with the Environmental Defense Fund to come up with a cap and trade model, which basically looks like this. So if you have a well-designed, operated wastewater treatment plant that puts out lower amounts of nitrogen in the water phase, it also produces less N2O, nitrous oxide. And it's a synergistic loop that actually catches. So if you're able to monetize at some point, we can build a better technology, lower aqueous emissions, lower gaseous emissions, more credits, better technology. So it kind of catches. It's not just additive. And then I'm happy also to report that the IPCC actually took the results of our studies, published quite a few years ago now, 2010, and those results are now part of the report that came out in November 2019, in terms of how to even begin to characterize this sector. What are the nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions, but nitrous oxide emissions from the waste sector? Stop blaming technologies that clean water for higher emission. It just doesn't work this way. They both go in the same direction. And so how do we get here? We can't keep estimating, and especially if the estimates are all wrong. We need actual measurements. So we developed to date, the only EPA endorsed protocol that exists to measure, not estimate, measure nitrous oxide emissions from wastewater treatment plants. This protocol was shared about 14 years ago with the Global Water Research Coalition. And to date, we still use this protocol. We're using this currently now to actually also help some major cities to characterize and recharacterize their water sector-based emissions, because these are some of the more forward-thinking cities in the US that have actually embraced and actually self-imposed some limits on their emissions. So that's the greenhouse gas story. Let's talk about energy very quickly. I just want to show you an image from, this is an anaerobic process in the city of Accra, Ghana. This is actually very, very close to my heart. I've been to this plant many times. I've actually worked in Accra and other parts of Ghana quite a bit. I've also flown out of Ghana quite a few times, in and out, obviously. And so this is actually a photo I took. And perhaps some of you can see this plume here, this brown plume. This is the Atlantic Ocean. This is Accra. And even though there is a plant, this treatment plant actually sits right across the highway here. Plant is empty, no sludge goes in there. All the fecal sludge gets dumped into the Atlantic Ocean. This is not because the technology doesn't work, it's because of another externality. And that's because, very simply, many countries around the world just don't have the energy to run systems like this. And it's that classic water energy, one aspect of the water energy nexus. Yes, it's great to have goals in terms of clean water, but then how you get there is very, very important. If we just take technologies from some parts of the world and just transplant them there, there just might not be enough energy to run these systems. So what do we do? What can we do? Let's go back to the blueprint again. So instead of sinking in more money, energy, resources, chemicals into this blueprint, and then just getting, let's say, partially treated water as a benefit, let's do a complete overhaul. And what do we get then? If we recognize now, first, by stopping, not uttering the word waste anymore and say used or enriched water, what can we extract? We can extract energy, we can extract chemicals from here, right as it comes from the sludge, from the biological reactor. Why put in air and spend a lot of energy? Why not do something else differently? And we can get energy from the solids as well. And then what have I not mentioned? We are getting clean water as the bonus. So we are actually getting clean water from the resources embedded within these waste streams. And that's very, very powerful. And that's what could potentially turn the sector completely around. And by the way, this is not science fiction. This is actually happening on the ground in many countries and many wastewater treatment plants and utilities. And so then we have to talk about economics and all of that stuff. I'll give you the bottom line here. For me, wastewater is essentially water plus carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Yes, we can recover the nitrogen and phosphorus and basically offset some of the requirement. So that if the entire circle is nitrogenous fertilizer use, the orange is what we can recover from human waste. Similarly, for phosphorus, the orange is what we can recover from human waste. Carbon, organic carbon, that's where the value lies. That's where the excitement is. Because if we stop for a moment and think beyond recovering the carbon in the form of methane, then we are talking about chemicals, we're talking about energy, we're talking about even hydrogen gas. And that's where the excitement is. And that's where we need to focus more. That's where we need to focus on. Is there a business case? Bottom line.
I have to ask you to wrap up, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Almost done. So from a very practical perspective, is there a business case? Yes, there is. The short answer is yes. The global demand for water and sanitation services, this is a gross underestimate. It's off by at least an order of magnitude. And in India, the lack of sanitation, for instance, results in a pretty substantial loss in productivity. And so there's a business case to be made for improved sanitation, more energy efficient sanitation, and so on. So again, the bottom line is, yes, what do we recover? What do we produce? Yes, we can produce biofuels, chemicals, plastics, hydrogen. All of this is done. Some of this is done at scale. But the point is, again, we should not be driven by technology. I'm a pure technologist, and I'm the one telling you, don't be driven by pure technology. Figure out what to do, where to do. And so always, all of this needs to address a higher objective. And we are thinking about decarbonizing the water sector. That is the higher objective, improving access to sanitation for the people who don't have it, but then giving them something that is actually relevant and contextually appropriate and feasible. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will confess that this is a sector that I am not personally familiar with, and I found it fascinating, the sort of argument over whether you're protecting the air or protecting the water, which it seems like innovation is going to hopefully solve that for us soon. And this idea of, needing to improve energy access across regions where that is lacking for some of this critical infrastructure, as well as all of the things that I usually hear about, like education and job growth and economic development. We are just exactly on time. We're going to turn to our fourth and final speaker before we open up to questions. Thijs Kassekker is with us, and Thijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Just let me start here with the introduction. Hope it works. Just a second, because I'm in the browser.
Take your time. If you're like me, you have 100 windows open. That's always my downfall, navigating in my screen.
Here it goes. Let's try to, here it is. Do you can see it?
We are still seeing it in the PowerPoint view, not the full screen view.
Okay, just let me try again and try to make this easier. I'll show you the entire screen, and this is sounds better. Now?
Perfect. Looks great. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So good morning to all of you. Nice to meet you. So and thank you a lot for having this space to discuss a little bit this study case with you. So I'm Thijs Kassekker. I work for the German Corporation in Brazil. So I'm the technical arm for this cooperation, and I work a lot with climate change issues in Brazil. That you must know, it's not being easy so much. But the idea here is to discuss a little bit the subnational role and competences for addressing climate change agenda, and also working with the decarbonization pathways. So if you are a little bit aware of the Brazil study case for the climate agenda, you know that it's very known that we have a lot of sectors to address and raise the climate ambition. So the deforestation, it's for sure the most important opportunity for Brazil, actually to build this path to decarbonization, to decarbonize the economy, decarbonize all of the sector, but also we have a lot to do with the agriculture emissions and also with the infrastructure, especially for energy and transportation. But if you take a little look to the whole country, you can see that it's not so easy, and it's not a massive. We are in a mosaic of different states, a different emissions profile here. So in the I don't know, maybe the left side of you can see the whole emission profile for Brazil. So most of almost 50% is the land use change, and almost 30% is the agriculture. But and we have a different emissions profile inside the country, and you can see here for the different sectors. So the green one is the climate, the land use change. So the yellow one is the agriculture. Then you comes to energy in red, and also the smaller ones. So I also brought here, and I'm very sorry because I wasn't able to get these figures in English, and I wasn't able to introduce them to you because they're, I don't know, in this file format. But in rows here, it's the GDP inside Brazil. So you can see here in the southeast region, São Paulo, Minas Gerais state, and Rio de Janeiro are the biggest ones, while all of the country, it's kind of similar with the small countries here. And also you can see here in purple the population, so the number of people inside the country. It's of course not regular. So you have, again, the southeast region accounts for the, I don't know, most of the country in Brazil. So we have a lot of challenges here for the subnational governments to position themselves in the climate agenda. So we are following that most of the countries have been making a lot of decarbonization commitments since Paris Agreement. In case of Brazil, we have the Ministry of Environment that is the responsible one to have the plans, to have the sectoral and also the subnational efforts coordinated to achieve those targets. But in practice, we don't have this happening especially in Brazil, in the last 3-4 years because of the current government. But this gives some space for some isolated protagonism. So we have also the private sector position themselves, and we have good examples here in the country. And of course, we have the subnational entities and some municipalities that have a lot of work being done in the past 4 to 3 years. But as I show you in the beginning, the states have different emission profile. They have different economic activities. And of course, there is a different decarbonization path that should reflect those differences. So we don't have the same solution for each one of the states. There is another challenge here because it's so difficult in Brazil, because there is some sectors, for example, the energy sector and the transportation, that the states, the subnational entities, doesn't have the mandate to attack the sector. So to actually diminish their emissions in the sector and have concrete actions that reflects in the emission profile. And this must be coordinated with the federal government, that it's not a reality right now. And there is another issue that, for example, the Amazon states have been acting together at the international arena. And this is something new for Brazil, because we haven't seen this before for United States, for example, but this is new for us. But in practice, you can see only the deforestation rates raising and not in a reduction path. So, of course, we know that subnational action, it's not enough for the country, but it's a very necessary step, at least, for have a plan, to have a joint action, and also to push the federal government to action. And I also wanted to bring to your attention this campaign, the international one for the Race to Zero. And this was I don't know, maybe the moment that here in Brazil, we were able to start working with the regions, working with the states to raise ambition to the net zero initiatives. So right now, I think we are, I don't know, 9 or 11 states that signed the Compromise to Race to Zero Alliance. And this is a very promising path, at least for us here in Brazil, to establish commitments and establish a real plan for this. And well, as the German comparison, I would like to bring you 2 examples, 2 case studies that I'm personally involved here in Brazil. That is Pernambuco and São Paulo case studies. And before starting, I just want to bring you well, the basis of it, the basis of the state. So São Paulo is the biggest state in GDP, in population. The percentage of urban population is very high, it's almost 100%. And as you can see, São Paulo and both Pernambuco have a different emission profile from the country. So most of the emissions comes from energy, because the deforestation rates, the deforestation emissions is almost concentrating Amazon region and a little bit in Cerrado, well, in the middle of the country. And this is not the case for these states, because they have the land use almost consolidating the state. But as you can see here, the GDP for Pernambuco representing the GDP of the country, it's only 3%. It's very different for the 30% of the São Paulo state. So despite of having this, I don't know, a similar emission profile, it's a very different state. So I come back to one of my first slides. We don't have a single solution for this. And this I want to try to bring beyond, well, Pernambuco decarbonization plan was released in the beginning of the year. I think it was in March and April. And for São Paulo, I'm still working with them for this. Actually, I just left them discussing a little bit about the financing of the plan, and I'm here with you to bring a little bit the results. But the idea is to have this plan until the end of the year. And I just also wanted to highlight that both states have their own climate change law, but Pernambuco, I think it's a little bit different because of the governance. So I don't have time to discuss in depth all of the steps or all of the important issues in building a plan, developing a plan, but the governance, it's a very, very important issue. And Pernambuco has their own climate change forum, it's a very huge step in those discussions. Okay, so just a very rapidly overview. This is the decarbonization plan in Pernambuco. So the concept here is to how we can ally the science with local knowledge and local participation through this forum. So we have done a lot of modeling process, not only for the climate change emission, but the economic and social profile for the state. And because we were downscaling, so what is the role of Brazil in the global decarbonization? What is the role of one of the Northeast region in Brazil for this decarbonization? And what is the role of Pernambuco state on this decarbonization? So this is different than working with Pernambuco state isolated, because we are part of a bigger solution. So here is the result. So this graph showing the decarbonization emission profile over the years. So yes, it's possible to have this net zero for the state until 2050. And this is the numbers of the avoided emission in the 2025 and 50. This is 50 at the end, and the different sectors behavior during this time. And here, just to bring to you, we were able to go to the end to have a lot of actions listed in these 4 strategic axes. And this is all available at the internet. So if you want to have all of this in details, you can reach me and I can show you the path, the link. But the idea here is yes, we have a plan. Yes, we have actions. We have concrete actions for the state. And yes, we have a monitoring system for all of these actions. So this is so important for all the public sector here in Brazil, because planning climate change, it's not something that we do as a regular path. We plan transportation, we plan energy, we plan agriculture, but we don't plan all of this together. And this is new. This is new for the public planning. And we won't be able to change the course for tomorrow, but we need to start this type of planning right now. Okay, so this is an important also numbers for us, because we were also able to measure the GDP growth, the well-being, the jobs. So the idea here is that if we were able to have this decarbonization path for the state, we will be able to have a higher GDP, more jobs and more sustainable jobs, what is very, very important for us. And just to bring you a little update, well, we launched the plan in March this year, and what about now, right? So yes, we are facing an elections in Brazil, the state elections and for president. So since, I don't know, July and August, we are facing a lot of political instability, and we were not able to move until now. But we really think that it's possible to have those planning resume next year. And all of this planning will be the basis for the next government, and with the finally having concrete actions for them. And well, this is Pernambuco. And for São Paulo here, I just brought some, I don't know, just to bring you the difference. So as I show you, São Paulo is very different. So it's the most industrialized state with the largest GDP in the country, with a very strong economic sector. And as I told you, they don't have the governance for climate change. So all of the conversations were done bilaterally on this period that we have a lot of political instability. So we were able to discuss energy with some important energy players that I'm not able to share with you, but this was the truth. And the decarbonization here in the state, its most important, the most important sectors for the state is the energy and the transportation. So as I told you, we have the mandate difficulties here because this needs to be aligned with the federal and municipalities. So just to bring you a number, so 80% of the energy in the state is important from the other states. So how São Paulo could set some goals, set some activities, and have those actions without having other subnational and the federal effort with this all interconnected system. So, but of course we. Okay, 1 minute, right?
Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. So, but of course we have a good sector. So we have good opportunities for other sectors. So agriculture and land use, because we have a lot of promising goals, mitigating goals for reforestation in the state. And as I told you, we are developing those plans. So this was basically all of the steps. So we are here almost going to the external consultation, and also being at COP would be a very important step for the state. And we are planning to launch the plan in December. And just to finalize my last slide here, so we are still facing some dilemmas, some internal dilemmas here with this decarbonization planning. So we are pretty sure that we won't be able to have those governance, this governance for the plan until the end of the year due to this political instability. So of course we know that this could compromise the implementation of the plan, but this is not something that we are able to solve right now. Another issue, but important one, is the financing. So it's the largest economy in the country. How we were able to finance this plan? So we are working hard on that. This is different from all the other subnational entities. That is the first, discussion that I'm part of it for the subnational in the climate agenda, and it's a very challenging one. Important thing also for São Paulo is that the state has a lot of sectorial plans. We have the low carbon agriculture plan, the energy plan, the transportation plan. And this climate change plan is aligned with all of them. So this is a very important issue for the state. Well, and the latest news that just came from today. So how to become a net zero? So far the mitigations, it's around 70% of the state emission. So we still have a lot of work to be done until the end of the year. I think this is all. Thank you for your time. This is my email, all the social profiles from JZ in Brazil, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Thais. I'm going to give a heads up to our student. They're going to promote you to a panelist so that you can connect your video and your microphone to ask your question. And Shannon will introduce our student and our first question.
Thank you. And thanks to all of our speakers. This has been really a very interesting discussion. And now I'd like to introduce a student who will be asking a live question today. Hadia Rashid is currently doing a bachelor's in development studies at Baria University in Pakistan, where she's on the rector's list for academic achievement. During her undergraduate study, she's pursued courses in climate change, global environment, sustainable development, and livelihood strategies, as well as social policy processes. Hadia has a keen interest in designing eco-friendly policies and reducing global reliance on fossil fuels, and wants to be involved in the solutions and mitigations of environmental challenges by pursuing a career in environmental governance and by working with organizations that contribute to the environment. She's also an entrepreneur, having started her own recycled handmade journal business, and she's a member of her college community support program, where they mostly work on arranging cleanup drives across their city. And she enjoys trekking and mountaineering as well in her spare time. So welcome to the Collaboratory, and please feel free to ask your question.
Thank you, Shannon, and good morning, everyone. So my question is more directed to Adrian Bo, but of course, anyone of the panelists could contribute to the answer. So my question is that, given your work with Inter-American Development Bank, in your perspective, what do you think that to what extent that multilateral development banks can play a role in helping the countries to set more robust fiscal policy and address the carbon risk issues to promote the just transition to green economies? And maybe whether you think that development banks might cooperate more to offer fiscal robustness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adia, for the question. Impressive CV, by the way. Congratulations. So I wanted to tell you a few things about fiscal policy, right? The way we've analyzed this at the IDB, a key issue is for countries that export fossil fuels, right? There's a lot of countries in the region that depend on royalties from oil production or gas production to fund a big chunk of the government, sometimes up to 15–20%. And what we've shown in two papers that I'm projecting here very quickly is that by 2035, if the rest of the world, it doesn't matter what the region does, if the rest of the world continues to transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles, the demand for fossil fuel produced from the region will reduce drastically. We think it's up to $5 trillion that the region could lose cumulatively between today and 2035 in terms of lost royalties from oil, and also up to $60 billion of lost revenues from gas. So what we're doing is showing them that and telling them it's very important to start thinking of a strategy to diversify the economy, your exports, and your fiscal strategy, right? And then another issue happens for countries like Costa Rica who tax gasoline consumption, right? If 20% of your revenues come from taxes on gasoline and cars, like it's the case in Costa Rica, and you have a plan for people to take the bus more and to use electric vehicles more, you're basically eroding your tax base, right? So we also did a study in Costa Rica looking at this issue and showing, I'm not going into the details, that the good news is that because a system based on electric vehicles and public transport would be cheaper overall, as I was saying before, the government can change the taxes, put taxes on electricity, put taxes on car ownership instead of gasoline consumption, things like that. And doing that, the government can make as much money as they would make if people would keep using cars with gasoline and paying gasoline taxes. But at the same time, making sure that everybody wins, because since the system is so much cheaper with electric vehicles, you're just growing the pie, right? So you can change the way you share the pie with different taxes and still ensure that firms and consumers win. That's just two examples. I just wanted to flag we have a full book on how ministers of finance can adapt fiscal policy to the climate change agenda. So I just wanted to show you that book here with the link. It has a lot more insights on what the governments can do on this issue.
Thank you so much. If anybody wants to ask a question, I know some of you have put some in the Q&A and some of them have already been answered by text by our panel, but feel free to keep sending them. I'm hoping we can do about 2 more. The next one I have, I'm going to put to Ben. Someone online has read the White House's Accelerating and Smoothing the Clean Energy Transition document, which I don't know exactly if you're familiar with it, but I would suspect that maybe you've given it a read. Although you might not need to know it to answer this question. The question is that a lot of the talk and a lot of the modeling work looks at technologies that are not yet mature. And the question is, how can the government support some of these technologies to sort of be fully developed and mature and remain competitive when they're competing against some of these like older, already proven technologies? And how do you sort of foster this transition and the research and development that's needed to roll out some of these new innovations?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually not familiar with that document, but that question certainly is one we think about quite a bit. I mean, the first thing to note is just, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act does that to an extent that we've never done that before. So, yes, there are technology neutral tax credits in electricity that ultimately will kind of on a volumetric basis certainly benefit wind and solar much more than some of the new technologies, but there are also a lot of other basically tax credits that are going towards technologies that are much more nascent and actually are much more basically weighted towards technologies that haven't been deployed yet. So something like a $3 tax credit for green hydrogen is, vastly overpowered compared to something like a solar tax credit. So some of those tax credits basically are market transformation sort of inherently at the levels they've been set. Direct air capture, for example. But then there's also just the R&D agenda that's also kind of funded additionally through the IRA. But things like the Earthshot, where certain technology areas have different targets and it guides funding from the DOE. You have things like ARPA-E that basically set up kind of like a public-private partnership. There are a lot of opportunities in that R&D space, but in terms of where the money is, a lot of that is going to come through some of the provisions in the IRA. We might not be counting on them basically kind of to hit our 2030 target, but I think ultimately the emissions benefits of some of those new technologies, whether they're deployed in the US or globally, past 2030 might even dwarf some of the impacts through 2030 in the US. So.
That end of your question gave me a great transition to my next one, which is something that I'm going to put to Kartik and Thijs, I think, in that order. You seem to have a little bit more work with some of these low income or emerging economies that are trying to undergo this transition. We have a number of questions about, can the techniques and strategies that were presented on the call today be applied equally in all countries and regions? What are some of the unique challenges that lower income countries face? And what are some of the strategies we can use to try to ensure that all of us are equally pulling together with support to bring about this energy transition? So Kartik first, and then Thijs, please feel free to jump in right after him.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. And so I'd like to just highlight this one point. Just because we label a certain country or a certain region low, middle, or high economy, that should not be governing the access to clean water and sanitation both. And primarily for this reason, the technologies that would be most appropriate are what come under the umbrella of non-sewage sanitation. So the current model here, of course, with centralized treatment, wastewater treatment, essentially implies or assumes connection to a pipe to essentially flush away the human waste. But if you go back to some of the older models of non-sewage sanitation systems, on-site sanitation systems, the focus here will be to functionalize them even better, to remove or to achieve objectives that are more relevant today, but then in a sense, go back to technologies or go to technologies which have been employed far more in some of these economies, some of these regions that we are talking about. So they are, and that's what we need to do. And there is a benefit. Inherently, these technologies don't rely on intensive aeration. So the energy footprint is lower. The nitrous oxide footprint is also lower. And frankly, this is the approach that also provides more access. And again, this is not a pipe dream. This is not science fiction. This is actually focused and centered in reality. Some of this work is already ongoing, long way to go. But again, this is all quite real.
Okay, just being very brief, I think it's very hard for me to have this answer because we have in Brazil, we have good universities, good access to technology. We have financing path, so it's clear the path to decarbonization the country. But we have a lot of problems in the political side. We have a lot of problems in assessing those financing. So I think it's something related to making the bridges between the technical, social, and the money at the end. So as the German comparison, we are working a lot with technical capacity for the public sector here in Brazil. And we see a lot of progress on this, but then comes the new government with new people and everything, it's beginning again. So it's something that will not be changed, I don't know, in the next 20 years. I try to be optimistic, but it's not the truth.
I think, yes, there are lots of challenges that remain, sort of financing this agenda. How do you encourage behavioral change? There was a question that came up with that regard that I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have time to answer unless anybody wants to take that one very quick as well. Any innovations people have to sort of encourage any of the kind of individual behavioral change that is needed to bring about this transition?
Can I say something very quickly, which is
yes.
that, I think it's the job of the government to make it convenient and to make it easy for people and firms to change their behaviors. But so the information campaigns and trying to ask people to change is going to have a limited impact compared to if the government organizes the city in a way that for you it's convenient to walk to the store and to walk to the school and to take the bus or take a bike to your home. That's much more important than telling people who live in places where the only option is a car, for instance, that they should change their lifestyle. If it's not easy, they just cannot do it. And I think same happens for the other big change that we need, which is people eating less beef, because beef has the highest environmental impact of any foods. I don't think that just telling that to people is gonna work, right? We should work on things like making it more easy when you go to the restaurant to have options that are not based on beef, or same at the if your kids are fed in school that they don't get used to eat beef every day, something like that. So I think it's government interventions really that need to make it convenient and the default option for people to do green stuff. Basically.
This idea of nudges, you can create an ecosystem where everybody is ever so gently nudged into making the right decision. I think we're going to have to stop it there. Shannon, did you want to come in? You turned on your camera, or you're all set? Any final remarks?
Oh, I'm all set. Thanks to all our panelists, but please go ahead and close the session. This has been great.
Well, I will also thank all of our wonderful panelists. It was so great to have you with us. Thank you, Thijs, Kartik, Adrian, and Ben. Really great presentations. I really enjoyed them. They're going to give me lots of food for thought for the rest of my week. Thank you so much as well to all the students and the general public who joined us online. It's been a great series of meetings. We're going to share the videos with everyone after if you missed anything or want to go back and check something again. And I wish everyone a great rest of your day or evening in whatever time zone that you joined us today from. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.